Aloha and welcome back to the garden. I'm Miss Amber and I'm excited for you to be here today. If you were with us last class, you might remember talking about composting. Can you remember the three phases of the compost system? Mesophilic phase, thermophilic phase, and maturation phase. Nice job. I thought we could begin today's class by taking a look at how our compost jar is doing. Let's see. At the very beginning, we can very distinctly see our layers of carbon and nitrogen ingredients in our compost jar. But let's take a look 1 week later, and we can already see some of those invertebrates showing up, and we know that we're in that first stage of our composting process. And after 2.5 weeks, we can't really even recognize what ingredients are in our compost jar anymore. They're all starting to turn brown and really looking like soil. I wonder how much longer until the process is finished. I was surprised to see how quickly the decomposers appeared in the compost. I think it's pretty cool that we can take our food and our yard waste and mix it together and watch it break down and decompose before our eyes. But we definitely couldn't do it without those compost organisms, those soil organisms. And so today we're going to take a closer look at our garden ecosystem and all the organisms that help keep our garden healthy. So I want you to take a moment to write down a list of all of the living organisms and non-living features that you would expect to find in a garden. Now, if you actually have a garden at home or have access to one, or have a nice yard space, then actually go outside and take a look around and write down any living organisms or non-living features that you see in that space. Remember to look closely and think small because there are a lot of tiny organisms out there. So pause the video and make your two lists, one of your living organisms and one of non-living features. And when you come back, we'll take a look at what you came up with. Okay, so hopefully now you have your two lists, one of living organisms and one of non-living features that you would expect to see in a garden or that you actually found outside. And these components are all parts of your garden ecosystem. An ecosystem is a community of living organisms and the non-living features that they interact with. So let's take a look at the different parts of the garden ecosystem that you found. And we'll start with the abiotic factors, and these are the non-living features. So some things you may have come up with were the soil, water, rocks, air, sunlight, and even temperature. These are all factors, non-living factors, that affect the living organisms within the ecosystem. Now let's take a look at the biotic factors, or the living organisms that affect the ecosystem. Your list might include pollinators like bees, butterflies, and moths, or soil organisms like our fungus, bacteria, and invertebrates. Or maybe you listed some specific invertebrates like worms, beetles, and centipedes. Or maybe you included some larger organisms like birds. And of course, I hope you have plants somewhere on your list because they are a crucial part of our garden ecosystem. Now, each of these organisms plays an important role in passing energy and nutrients through the ecosystem. And we can see this flow of energy and cycling of nutrients by looking at our garden food web. In every food web, there are producers, consumers, and decomposers. Producers are organisms that produce their own food by using energy from the sun through a process called photosynthesis. Those are our plants. Consumers are organisms that get their energy by eating other living plants and animals. And we divide our consumers into different categories based on what they eat. Our primary consumers are herbivores, meaning they only eat plants. Secondary consumers can be omnivores, meaning they eat both plants and animals, or they can be carnivores, meaning they only eat animals. But our secondary consumers eat primary consumers and producers. And last, we have our tertiary consumers, our third level of consumers. And these organisms are carnivores, and they eat other consumers. So our producers get their energy from the sun, and our consumers get their energy by eating other living plants and animals. And lastly, we have our decomposers, which you may remember from our last lesson, our composting lesson. Our decomposers eat and break down organic matter, or things that were once alive and are now dead. So let's go back to our list of living organisms, or biotic factors, in our garden ecosystem. Take a moment to think about what each of those organisms eats and decide whether it's a producer, a consumer, or a decomposer. Once you have them categorized by their ecosystem role, let's see if we can connect them in a garden food web. All food webs start with the sun because that is the source of energy for the entire system. Now follow the energy flow through the system and add in your producers first, then your primary consumers. Next, add any secondary and tertiary consumers. Lastly, our decomposers take care of any dead plant or animal material along the way and end the flow of energy and return the nutrients back to the soil. So we can start to see how all of these organisms are interconnected in our garden ecosystem. As these organisms eat, energy and nutrients are passed from one organism to the next throughout our garden food web. So plants absorb energy from the sun, and as that energy is transferred through the food web, some is released as heat energy, and some is used by the organism and transferred on to the next until the energy is used up in the decomposition process. Nutrients, however, cycle through the system. Plants absorb nutrients through their roots from the soil, and those nutrients are passed from plant to animal all the way through the food web until the nutrients are returned back into the soil by the decomposers. All of these organisms help make this cycle possible. Now, there are some organisms that we don't want in our garden, and we refer to these unwelcome critters as pests. Now, what makes a critter in the garden a pest? In general, a pest is any organism that has a negative effect on the garden ecosystem. Now, that might be organisms that harm or eat our plants, like aphids and mites and caterpillars, or it might be an organism that spreads disease, like mice and rats and slugs and snails, or it might be an organism that affects our soil and the roots of the plants, things like nematodes and microbes. Now, gardeners have an important role in the garden ecosystem as ecosystem managers. And so one of our jobs is to help keep our garden and our plants healthy by helping to manage some of these garden pests, and also to help introduce beneficial organisms into the garden. What are some ways that we can help manage pests in the garden without using chemical pesticides? One way is by using a method called integrated pest management. And the first step in this method is prevention. So if we start our gardens off with healthy soil and healthy seeds, and we make sure there's plenty of sunlight and just enough water that our plants need, then we can help minimize the chance of introducing pests that feed on unhealthy plants or that like to live in really wet, moist areas. Our next step is to just monitor the garden and the plants. It's important to identify any problems with your plants early, so that way you can fix the problem early. Most plants can handle a little bit of pest problems, but if it starts to become overbearing, it can really harm the plant itself. Some things to look for are discoloration, spotting, holes, and mold on your plant leaves. Or you might even see the pests themselves. If we do need to address a pest problem, there are some methods that we can use that don't involve chemical pesticides. We don't want to be spraying chemicals on our plants and on our soil because the plants can absorb those chemicals, and then we can absorb those chemicals when we eat those plants. We can help keep pests away naturally by encouraging a healthy ecosystem. There are many plants that we can grow in between our fruits and vegetables that actually help to repel different kinds of pests. Some examples include basil and chamomile, onion, marigold, geranium, dahlias, and mint, among many others. Many of these plants also have flowers that help attract pollinators like bees and butterflies and moths to our garden plants, and this is also really beneficial for our garden ecosystem. So by building healthy soil and supporting a biodiverse garden food web, we can help create a productive and healthy garden ecosystem. If you have the opportunity to, try planting some beneficial flowering plants outside of your house or maybe even in a pot on your lanai to help introduce some of those beneficial organisms into your community and your ecosystem. Mahalo for joining me in the garden today. I'll see you next time. Aloha.